Welcome back to another podcast episode of the Empire Builders Then and Now. I'm your historian host, Will Tiemann.
And I'm the analytics guy along for the ride, Mike Treniff.
We're really excited about this episode. This episode is D-Day, the most complicated invasion ever attempted. And we will start with June 5th, 1944, 9:15 in the evening. A man sits alone at a desk in a country house in southern England. Outside it is raining. He can hear it on the windows. He picks up a pen and he begins to write a letter that he hopes nobody will ever read. The letter is short. It begins, "Our landings in the Cherbourg area have failed to gain satisfactory foothold and I have withdrawn the troops." He pauses. Then he adds, "If any blame or fault attaches to this attempt, it is mine alone." He folds the letter, puts it in his pocket, and goes to bed. In a few hours, 156,000 men will cross the English Channel. Many will die, and Dwight Eisenhower has already decided that if they fail, he will not blame the weather. He will not blame his generals. He will not blame bad luck. He will walk in front of the world and say, "I did this. It went wrong. This is on me." That letter was never supposed to exist. We only know about it because an aide found it crumpled in Eisenhower's jacket 3 weeks later. He had actually just forgotten to throw it away.
I want to stop you right there, and sorry if I can interject, before we go any further into that history, because that letter tells you something important that most D-Day coverage completely misses.
Yeah, go ahead.
Everyone focuses on D-Day as a military operation, right? The ships, the beaches, the casualties, the dramatic scene that you picture in your mind, right? But the deeper story is a decision making story, I think. And the first decision, the one that made everything else possible, wasn't made on June 6th, right? It was made long before, when Eisenhower decided what kind of leader he was going to be. Would you say so?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Mike. And I think that's why the story still matters 80 years later. Because the question isn't really how did they pull off D-Day? The question is, how do human beings make irreversible decisions under conditions of radical uncertainty, right?
Exactly.
And then live with the consequences.
Yep.
But to understand what the decision actually meant, the weight of it, you need to understand the problems the Allies were actually facing in 1943. And it was a problem with no good solution, right? Germany controls Europe from the Atlantic coast of France to deep inside the Soviet Union. The Allies are bombing relentlessly. They're fighting in North Africa, in Italy. But here's the brutal reality. You cannot bomb an army into surrender, right? You cannot strangle a continent from the air. At some point, somebody has to go back into Europe. Somebody has to put boots in the ground. Somebody has to go through Hitler's front door. And everyone knows it, including Hitler.
Which creates, to me, a fascinating strategic paradox. This is almost unique in military history because both sides know an invasion is coming, and both sides are preparing for it, right? The Allies can't hide that they're building towards something massive. The German intelligence services can see the forces amassing in England. They know, right?
Right. So the invasion really isn't a secret. The location is the secret, and that changes really everything.
Right. Now I want to make sure listeners understand why location matters so much, right? Because it's not really obvious. France has roughly 3,000 miles of Atlantic coastline, right? Germany cannot defend all of that coastline equally. They have to concentrate their best forces somewhere, right? They have to make a decision, which means that the Allies have to make Germany concentrate them in the wrong place.
Yeah, and this is why D-Day isn't really a military story at the deepest level. It's a story about information, attention, and illusion. But before we get to deception, which is absolutely extraordinary, we need to talk about something that almost never comes up in D-Day coverage, just this psychological dimension, right? Because the men planning this invasion, they're not optimists. They are men carrying very specific memories of very specific disasters. Winston Churchill. By 1944, Winston Churchill is 69 years old. he has been in public life for pretty much 40 years. And burned in his memory permanently, painfully, is one word: Gallipoli.
1915. Yep.
1915. And Churchill at that point was First Lord of the Admiral. I am terrible at saying that word. I don't know why. But he championed a plan to force the Dardanelles Straits, open a route to Constantinople, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The idea was bold, arguably brilliant. The execution was absolutely catastrophic. Over 250,000 Allied casualties, a complete failure. Churchill was forced to resign. His career nearly ended. And now, 29 years later, someone is asking him to approve another massive amphibious invasion.
I want to push on this because I think Churchill's Gallipoli fear is actually misunderstood by most historians. I mean, you tell me, you're the historian, but people treat it as a simple psychological scarring, right? Trauma making him timid, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Churchill's caution about a direct cross-channel invasion wasn't irrational, right? The early Allied plans were dangerously undercooked, I would say. There was a 1942 plan called Operation Sledgehammer, a rushed cross-channel assault that most serious military analysts would now believe would have been a disaster, right? Churchill killing that plan wasn't weakness; it was judgment, right?
Right. So the scar became wisdom rather than paralysis. Would that be correct?
At least partially, eventually, I think. But here's what's interesting: he also delayed the right operation long enough that the Americans nearly broke with him over it. Right? Roosevelt and Marshall were furious. There's a version of history where the Anglo-American alliance fractures in 1942 over this disagreement, I think.
Yeah, which is a reminder that wisdom and stubbornness can look identical from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
So by 1943, the decision is made: this invasion will happen. The question becomes, naturally, who leads it? And this is one of my favorite appointments in military history, because the obvious choice, the choice everyone expected, was George Marshall. He was, and we actually talked about him in an earlier podcast. He was the Army Chief of Staff, the architect of America's entire war strategy. Roosevelt told him the job was his, and Marshall wanted it desperately, to be honest with you. But Roosevelt gave it to Eisenhower instead.
And I think this is worth sitting with because it was a genuinely counterintuitive decision if you think about it. Eisenhower had never commanded men in combat.
Nope.
He was an administrator. He was a planner, a diplomatic fixer, right? Patton had commanded tanks in North Africa. Montgomery had won at El Alamein. MacArthur was fighting across the Pacific. So by conventional military logic, Eisenhower wasn't the most qualified general in the room, right?
No, but Roosevelt understood something that pure military logic misses, right? Operation Overlord wasn't primarily a battlefield command problem. It was really a coalition management problem.
Exactly, and this is where I actually disagree with the conventional reading slightly. People say Eisenhower was chosen because he was a great diplomat who could manage British and American egos. That's true, but I think it's also incomplete. The deeper reason is that Eisenhower had demonstrated something rarer than just tactical genius, right? He understood systems. He understood how to make complex organizations with competing incentives move in the same direction, and that's an extraordinarily rare skill, of an extraordinarily rare leadership skill if you think about it, right? And it was precisely the skill that this particular operation required. Think about what he's actually managing, right? You've got Bernard Montgomery, brilliant, vain, genuinely difficult, beloved
Monty?
by the Brit.
Monty?
Old Monty? No, I mean the British troops loved him though, right? And,
They did.
And this guy thinks he should be in overall command and really never stops implying it, right? And then you have George Patton, who is aggressive, charismatic, insubordinate, actually the general that a lot of people agree Hitler feared the most. and whom Eisenhower has had to publicly sideline now after a series of incidents in Sicily, but whom he still cannot afford to lose. So British and American air commanders who fundamentally disagree about how air power should be used, right? That's kind of the dynamic here. Then you have Churchill second-guessing strategic decisions almost weekly. De Gaulle, not even formally recognized by Roosevelt as France's legitimate government, right? Causing constant diplomatic fires. And Eisenhower has to keep all these people aligned, motivated, and moving in the same direction, right? I mean, he's herding cats for a bath, essentially.
Yep.
And this is all while planning the largest military operation in human history, while pretending a fake army exists in southeast England.
Let's talk about this fake army for a second. The name was Operation Fortitude, and I've been studying military history for a long time, and Fortitude still astonishes me because the scale of that deception is just absolutely insane. It's almost perfect. The Allies need Hitler to believe the main invasion is coming to Calais, the shortest crossing point, the most obvious landing spot, which means Hitler is already predisposed to believe it. They're not trying to sell him some crazy story. They're just confirming what he already suspects.
Which is the first principle of effective deception, right? You don't create a false belief from scratch. You feed and amplify a belief that the target already holds, right?
100%. And so they created an entire fictional army. The first United States Army Group, FUSAG, what it stands for. They have inflatable tanks positioned where German reconnaissance planes will photograph them. Fake landing craft on rivers. Fake oil storage facilities. Fake military camps with fake radio traffic. Entire fake conversations between fake units. Real roads built leading nowhere, just to show up in aerial photographs.
Wild.
And then they put one man in command of this ghost army, General S. Patton.
Because Patton is the one Allied general Hitler genuinely respects and fears.
Oh, 100%. So they really use Hitler's own strategic logic against him. Of course the Americans would put their best general in charge of the most important operation. Of course Patton would lead the real invasion. Therefore, wherever Patton is, that's where the invasion's coming. Patton is the bait, and Normandy is the hook.
And it works, right? Beyond anyone's expectations. Not just before the invasion, after it. Even when Allied soldiers are actually on the beaches of Normandy, Hitler holds his panzer reserves back for weeks. Because he's convinced Normandy is a feint, right? He still thinks this is the fake thing. The real invasion, Patton's army, is still coming at Calais. Those
right.
panzer divisions still sitting idle could have pushed the entire operation back into the sea, right? Could have pushed the Allies back into the sea at Normandy.
Oh, for sure. And, here's what I find most striking about Fortitude is it works not because the Germans are foolish. It works because they're really confident. They had built a detailed, logical model of Allied intentions. Calais made sense, right? Shortest crossing, best port infrastructure, direct route into Germany. When Fortitude fed them information confirming that model, they just really accepted it. When signals appeared, activity near Normandy, they just discounted it because it didn't really fit what they already knew.
Yep, and this is the defining failure mode of expertise, if you will, right? The smarter you are, the better you become at explaining away evidence that challenges what you already believe. The German intelligence services weren't stupid, right? They were expert, and at a certain level, expertise becomes a sort of blindness. And if
Absolutely.
you listened to the last episode about Henry Ford, right, there's that's kind of a common thread among genius, expert level leaders. You see this everywhere. If you look for a more modern example, right, something a lot less historically groundbreaking than Normandy, right? Look at Blockbuster, right?
That was historically groundbreaking to me because I loved going to the video store every Friday night.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you look at them, their executives weren't stupid, right? They had decades of experience in the video rental business. They could construct a perfectly rational argument for why Netflix's model wouldn't work. But every piece of that argument made sense inside the model they'd already built. But the model was wrong, right? They were not taking in new information and allowing that model to evolve over time. They were not bringing in new information. That model was fixed. And
Right.
so it broke, right?
Right, and going back to D-Day, June finally arrives. The weather is absolutely catastrophic. They actually just made a movie about this. I watched it recently. It's very good. It's called Pressure, with Brendan Fraser, who's
Oh,
General
wow.
Eisenhower. Yeah, but going back to the real story, storms in the channel, the waves were way too high for a landing craft. Cloud cover that grounds the Air Force. Really years of planning, the deception, the coalition, logistics, and suddenly hostage to a North Atlantic weather system. And all eyes turn to one man, Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist, whose job it is now to predict the future of Western civilization. That's a pretty tough job to have.
And Steg's situation is a fascinating case studying communicating uncertainty to decision makers, right? Because what he actually has is probabilistic data with very wide confidence intervals, right? Which is to say, he has data that's, well, maybe this will happen, maybe it won't, and he can't be really certain. He can't be really tightly certain about anything.
Meteorologists can't.
Yeah, exactly, right. I always say I wish I could be wrong 50% of the time at my job and still keep my job. But what this guy doesn't know is that there is a window, or he thinks there might be one.
And, Eisenhower really needs an answer. Not a probability, but a real 100% answer.
Yeah, which is the fundamental tension between between analysts and leaders. I personally know this all too well. Analysts want to be precise about their uncertainty, right? We need to call it out. We need to quantify that uncertainty. Leaders need to act, right? Like they don't want to hear about my confidence intervals, right? They need to act. They need to make decisions.
Oh, yeah. Great leaders make decisions based on analysts' opinions. And Stagg does tell Eisenhower there may be a window. 36 hours, possibly less, beginning June 6th. Possibly. Eisenhower sends everyone out of the room. He sits alone for a few minutes, comes back, looks at the weather maps, looks at Stagg, is quiet for a long time. Then he says, "Okay, we go. I want to sit in that moment because we've heard those words so many times that they've lost their weight. So let me try to give them back." At that moment, Eisenhower says those words. He does not know if he is ordering the liberation of Europe or the deaths of 100,000 men. He generally does not know. The honest answer, the only honest answer, is that it could go either way. And he still says, "Let's go."
And I think this is the most important leadership lesson in the entire story, right? And it's a deeply uncomfortable one, I think, because we have a cultural narrative that says great leaders always have clarity, right? We have this idea that clarity, that vision is what makes a great leader. That somewhere between gathering enough information and consulting enough experts, certainty arrives.
And it really doesn't.
It doesn't, right? It never does. Not at the level of decisions like that actually matter and that honestly determined the course of Western civilization.
That really did matter. That decision did matter, didn't it?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, here's what the research on high stakes decision making actually shows. The quality of a decision and the quality of its outcome are not the same thing, right? Eisenhower could have made exactly the right call with the right process, and it still failed if that single weather window closed an hour earlier than Stagg had predicted. A worse leader could have made the same call and gotten lucky. We tend to judge decisions by their outcomes because outcomes are visible, right? They are directly observable. But the decision itself, the process, the reasoning, the courage, that's entirely separate.
Yes, it absolutely is, which means doing the right thing always isn't a guarantee, and that's a kind of going to be a common theme throughout our podcast here. But it's just the best available bets. And then midnight arrives, June 5th, just after 12. The sky, the channel, it's still storming, but 13,000 paratroopers are ready in the air. These are the first men, the one who go before the beaches, before the ships, before the world knows anything is happening. They're flying in a complete darkness. Anti-aircraft fire is already coming up from below. Orange streaks in the black sky. Planes taking evasive action. Formation finally breaks, and the green lights come on inside the planes. Go. A 21-year-old from Ohio or Georgia or Iowa stands in the door of an aircraft, 800 feet above occupied France, in the dark, in the rain, and then jumps.
I want to note something about the paratrooper drops, because they were, by any objective measure, at least partially a disaster, right? The was it the
100%.
82nd? Yeah, the 82nd and 101st Airborne were supposed to land in tight clusters to seize specific objectives, specific targets, right? Causeways, bridges, gun batteries. Instead, the drops scattered men across a 50 square mile area, right? Some units landed miles from their targets. Soldiers landed in flooded fields and drowned under the weight of their own equipment. I mean, Jesus, think about that for a second, right? Entire groups came down far from where they were supposed to, and by morning, most units were at maybe a quarter strength, badly disorganized, officers separated from their men that they were commanding. And yet the chaos helped.
I mean, for sure. Yeah, I'll actually point to a story. So Germany actually planted fake fields that were filled with water. So that was half of Germany. Yeah, I mean, it was still a disaster. But Germany did not help, but they caused some of this confusion as well.
Well, and that's interesting, because the chaos actually, you could argue, kind of helped, right? German commanders couldn't determine where the main thrust was because there wasn't one, right? You didn't have those people landing in those tight clusters that would have made them easier to target. There were small groups of paratroopers fighting and making noise across such a wide area that the Germans couldn't distinguish the feint from the real assault. The plan failed, but the outcome succeeded because the men adapted.
And this is something I find genuinely moving about D-Day. Small troops of paratroopers scattered across Normandy in the dark. A sergeant with 8 men he's never met. No radio, no officers, and no orders. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't even know the beaches have been taken or if the whole entire operation has collapsed. That's a scary thought, because these men would be stranded. And he makes a decision. We move toward the sound of guns. That sergeant is making choices with incomplete information in the dark at 22 years old. And the operation depends on thousands of men like him making the same choice independently.
Yeah. I mean, dude, if you picture that is incredibly moving, right? I mean, just the heroics on the ground like that. I mean, it's really... You don't think about that very often, but I mean, anyway. But this also reveals something important about how complex operations actually succeed, right? Eisenhower's plan couldn't execute itself.
Nope.
At some point, authority has to be pushed all the way down, to the person who can actually see what's in front of them, right? You mentioned those sergeants on the ground. And, most organizations never figure this out because it requires a specific kind of trust that's genuinely hard. You train people intensively, you give them clear intent, not detailed orders necessarily, but intent, and then you let them make calls you'll never know about, right? It's kind of the ultimate in delegation.
Yeah, but the alternative is waiting for orders that never come, and that's actually worse. Then comes Omaha Beach. I've read many accounts of Omaha for a long time, and I still find it difficult to describe. The Americans approaching Omaha Omaha face a beach about a mile wide. Behind it, bluffs rising 100 feet. The Germans have had 4 years to fortify these bluffs. Machine gun positions, artillery, mines on the beach, obstacles in the water. The pre-invasion bombing designed to destroy these positions, they largely miss. The naval bombardment designed to suppress them, it doesn't. The special amphibious tanks built to support the infantry mostly sink in the rough seas before they actually reach the shore. And then the landing craft arrive. The ramps go down. Some men are killed by machine gun fire before they even take a single step towards the beach. Others step into water deeper than expected and drown under the heavy weight of their equipment. The men who make it to the beach have almost no cover. The plan is gone.
In Omaha Beach is sometimes held up as evidence that D-Day almost failed, right? But that's not entirely accurate either. The confusion at Omaha, the chaos there, terrible as it was consistent with the broader operation succeeding, I would argue, right? Because while Omaha was a catastrophe, Utah Beach, 20 miles west, came ashore with fewer than 200 casualties, right? The British and Canadian beaches were costly, but they were successful. The paratroopers, as scattered as they were, had created enough chaos inland to prevent coordinated German attacks.
I'm going to push back on that. There's a risk of retrospective rationalization here. In hindsight, the broader operation succeeded despite Omaha. But the men dying on the beach, they didn't know that. And there were moments, there were documented real moments where senior commanders were genuinely considering whether to write off Omaha entirely. Pull back, accept the loss, consolidate elsewhere. The operation succeeding it wasn't inevitable. It was contingent on individual soldiers in conditions of absolute total chaos deciding whether to keep moving.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think that reinforces the decentralization point, right? The operation couldn't be saved from headquarters. It could only be saved by those people on the ground experiencing that chaos.
You're 100% right. And there's a captain, his name's John Spaulding, and he actually found a gap in the German wire. He takes a small group of men up a draw in the bluffs, right? He gets above the German positions. He starts taking them from behind. Other groups actually saw this, and they follow. And slowly, painfully, expensively, these bluffs begin to fall. Nobody ordered Spaulding to find that gap. Nobody could have. He just found it. And as a good, true American, he acted.
I'll say that is just some good old-fashioned American ingenuity right there, baby.
That's right.
I want to connect this to something more modern, right? Because I think there's a specific lesson from D-Day that gets lost in the general, leadership and courage narrative. Because D-Day succeeded because of a combination of things that rarely come together, right? Extreme centralization at the strategic level. Eisenhower holding the whole picture, making the call, accepting personal responsibility. And extreme decentralization that we keep talking about at the tactical level, right, on the ground. Individual soldiers empowered to make decisions without orders, right? Most organizations today have neither. They have sort of this middle centralization where nothing really gets done. You almost have the worst of both worlds. Senior leaders too far from the ground to make good calls, but close enough to second guess the people who can.
Yeah, that does produce the worst of both worlds, doesn't it?
Yeah, and nobody owns the decision, right? People pretend to, but nobody's empowered to adapt. I mean, think about how many organizations have failed not because they lacked smart people or resources, but because the people who could see the problems, the ones close to the customers, close to the market, couldn't get the organization to move. and the people who could authorize the movement couldn't see what was happening, right? So you have this top to bottom disconnect.
I'm going to give an example because this is going to be later on down the road in our episodes. But Kodak's engineers knew digital photography was coming.
In 1975, Kodak invented the digital camera. The engineers knew, the middle managers knew, the senior leaders were protecting the film business, and the engineers couldn't override them. I mean, that's kind of the opposite of this D-Day thing, right?
Yep.
Where those people on the ground took control and made a wild success, out of nothing. But Spalding found the gap. Kodak's engineers found the gap. One of them was allowed to move through it.
That's right. And I want to add something before we close here, because there's a dimension here that goes way beyond organizational design. We live in an era that is deeply suspicious of institutions, and probably, very fair as well. But sometimes, for good reason. D-Day is a reminder of what institutions that are built carefully, led well, held accountable, can actually accomplish. This wasn't a charismatic individual who saved the day. It was a coalition, a system. Meteorologists and engineers and code breakers and supply officers and junior sergeants and admirals and resistance fighters. They're all moving in the same direction. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone at the top took personal responsibility for making it work. And because the people at the bottom were trusted to think and act.
And that brings us back to the letter that you mentioned earlier, right? The one Eisenhower wrote and never sent, never used. I think it's the most important document of the entire operation. Not because of what it says, but because of what writing it did. The act of writing that letter forced Eisenhower to fully internalize that the decision was his, right? It wasn't the Weathers, it wasn't Montgomery's, not the German Panzers, his. And once you've written your failure letter, or once you sort of come to grips with that, you stop looking for exits, right? You stop hedging, you stop managing your reputation and start managing the outcome. Because you've already accepted the possibility of the worst happening. There's a concept in decision science called prospective hindsight, which is imagining failure in great detail before a decision that makes you sharper about what needs to go right. Right, so it's almost like fake hindsight. It's almost like grasping the benefits of hindsight. Right, people say hindsight is 20/20. But you're almost simulating that hindsight so that you can grasp the benefits of it before the thing actually happens.
Makes sense.
And Eisenhower stumbled into one of the most powerful cognitive tools in leadership, and he didn't have a fancy name for it. He just called it accountability.
I want to end where I started a little bit. That letter folded in Eisenhower's jacket. If any blame or fault attached to the attempt, it is mine alone. Here's what I keep coming back to. Eisenhower didn't write that letter for history. He didn't write it to be admired. He wrote it because he believed it to be true. He was about to send over 150,000 human beings into the most dangerous place on earth. The least he could do was own up to what happened to them. That's it. That's the whole thing. Not the ships, not the deception, not the weather window. The most important thing about D-Day is that the man at the top was willing to stand underneath it.
Yeah, in history books, remember D-Day as a military triumph, and it was. But I think the deeper truth is that it was a systems triumph, right? Proof that human beings, given clear intent, genuine trust, and leaders who absorb risk rather than distributing it downward, can do things that seem impossible.
And maybe that's why we keep coming back to it, not because we want to remember the war, but because we want to remember what we're capable of. what we decide the mission is bigger than the outcome for any of us.
Yeah, I mean, D-Day wasn't proof that great leaders make great plans.
Yeah, it was proof that great leaders make great decisions and then trust the people around them to handle everything the plan got wrong.
Man,
Well,
what a story to bring in the 4th of July. Holy smokes.
I love it. I love it. Except we're on a delay for a few weeks, so
I guess.
our listeners won't be able to hear it until maybe August 4th. But it was a great July 4th. Maybe we'll actually put this in this week's because it is 4th of July. I like that, Mike. We're going to give the people what they want and give them a great
Give them what they want.
4th of July to remember. But thanks a lot. We'll be here next Tuesday for another great history story and strategic lens by my friend Mike Treniff.
All right. Thanks, guys.